Into the next video, Japan is getting ready for war. Let's see
Did
what
you
they're
know
doing
that
to
Japan
prepare.
is the only country in the world whose constitution explicitly renounces war?
Well, yeah, they were isolationists, and then they decided to try to help and take over parts of China and parts of the coast here on the south of their country. And they were kicked back by the Americans, and then they were bombed and firebombed, and their entire country was destroyed. And then they were kind of like under occupation for America, from America for a long time. So they were barred and restricted from being able to even have a military.
Yes, the land of cherry blossoms and cutting-edge tech has a no-war clause
Beautiful
written
cherry
into
blossoms
its
are
very
amazing.
DNA.
I have a cherry
That's why it's
blossom
so
Lego
obvious
trio
that a
right over my
transformation is
shoulder.
underway. Japan's military today is almost unrecognizable compared to the modest, defense-only force it once had. However, this
Yeah.
transformation isn't surprising to anyone who's been paying attention to Japan's history. The world might see Japan as the poster child of pacifism, but the reality is far
Yeah, they
more
were forced
complicated.
pacifism.
For decades,
Yeah.
Japan has walked a fine line, balancing peaceful ideals with the harsh realities of living in a dangerous neighborhood. But now the balance is tipping, and Japan is rethinking what pacifism really means in a world that's
Mm.
growing increasingly unstable. The
Yeah.
writing is on the wall.
You ever hear the
Japan is
saying, "It's
entering
better to be a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war"? And this is kind of the idea is that if war is brewing, you better be prepared for it because it will wipe you the hell out.
a new
You
chapter,
got to be
one
prepared
that could
for it.
very well end the pacifist nation we thought we knew, and one that may soon see Japan return to the very war stance it swore off decades ago. Let's talk about it. Explaining why Japan swore off war in the first place seems like a pretty good place to start. After all, Japan's deep-rooted pacifism
Probably
is
all
a
started in
far cry from the
1945.
militaristic powerhouse the nation was just a few generations ago. To understand this massive transformation, we must rewind the clock to a time
But I believe we also helped rebuild Japan as well. So, like, not only did we say, "Hey, stop it. You're not allowed to do this anymore." I think we also helped them rebuild their entire economy and rebuild all of this shit that we firebombed and that we dropped those bigger, larger situations on those two
time
cities.
when Japan was a proud empire, an empire driven by ambition, imperialism, and a brutal military machine. This machine was made possible by the sweeping industrialization of the late 19th and early 20th century. The rapid rise of factories, railroads, and military infrastructure, coupled with a swelling sense of nationalism, ballooned Japan's ambitions. It also turned Japan's gaze outward. The country felt threatened by the dominance of Western powers, so it sought to carve out its own empire, especially in Asia. The Japanese
Hmm.
military's increasing role was
Trying to
directly
take over
tied to
China.
the nation's imperial dreams. This was a country that was prepared to fight, conquer, and expand at all costs. A country willing to drench its hands in blood on an industrial
Well, you see, they needed to because they don't have enough resources within their own country. So if they ever wanted to expand or have more self sustainability and be actually isolationists and not have to trade with other countries, they're going to have to take over other countries' resources. And there's actually a point in the war where of World War II, I believe, where they had to continue to take over land so they could afford and have the resources to continue to take over land. So it was like they were required to at some point, where if they had stopped, the war would have been stopped because they wouldn't have had the right any fuel. They wouldn't have had the equipment that they needed. They wouldn't have had the food that they needed. A lot of these people, whenever these soldiers, whenever they went out to battle and fight, they were basically you had to fight to have food that night. Like you didn't have the rations, you didn't have the supplies that you needed from coming from your government. So you'd have to take the supplies and rations from the people that you're fighting. So it's either win or retreat. Those are the options. And Japanese people do not retreat. That's the whole thing with the kamikaze pilots. They do not retreat.
scale. So by the time the 1930s rolled around, Japan was on the warpath. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, deepening
Hmm.
its aggressive expansion in the Asia-Pacific region, which began with the annexation of Taiwan in 1895 and
Hmm.
Korea in 1910. By 1941, Japan had escalated this ambition to new extremes, culminating in the attack on Pearl Harbor. This action single-handedly thrust the world into the Pacific theater of World War II. Over the course of the war, Japan's military engaged in atrocities.
Hit first, hit fast, hit hard. That was their idea is that they'd be able to cripple the United States military that was stationed in Hawaii for their Pacific Fleet, and that they would be able to do so much damage and get themselves set up so well and reinforced that they would be able to handle America after they had recouped and had a counteroffensive.
Atrocities, including the horrific Nanking massacre, which claimed an estimated 100,000 to 300,000
Mhm.
Chinese lives. The
So
country was
sad.
becoming a force to be reckoned with, but also a pariah in the eyes of the rest of the world. Yet this aggression came at an unimaginable cost. According to some estimates, over 3 million Japanese soldiers and
Mm.
civilians died in the conflict. Another 200,000 plus lives were wiped out in the flash of the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The shock of these bombs marked the devastating climax of a war that had already changed the world in unspeakable ways.
We killed so many innocents with those bombs. So, I think the general consensus on the bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki were that the idea of trying to have a land invasion of Japan, even though it was in ruins by this time because we had firebombed the crap out of them, was the thought was so hard because everybody was going to be fighting so hard for their homeland and we were on their home turf that we would have lost hundreds of thousands of people on both sides, millions of people total. If we had tried to take over Japan directly with a land and air and sea invasion, this was our one last attempt to get them to surrender without us having to do that because we were closing in on them. And honestly, the fact that they surrendered, we sure, I agree. A lot of innocent people were ended because of that. And I think more would have been lost if we had to do the alternative.
But it wasn't just the loss of life that led to Japan's turn away from militarism. It was also the utter humiliation that followed. A nation that had once stormed the Pacific with its imperial ambitions was now on its knees, with its emperor forced to address the nation over the radio to announce Japan's surrender. The Japanese people, who had never before heard the voice of their
Mhm.
emperor, were struck by the finality of it all. They realized that the militarization of Japan had been a mistake, and with that realization came a deep-seated hatred of anything military. After Japan's defeat, General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander of the Allied powers, spearheaded the country's demilitarization. His goal was simple: to create a better world out of the blood and carnage of the past, and that world, he believed, was one where Japan would never again wield military power. The centerpiece
Some still didn't surrender after the emperor? Yeah. So, obviously communication wasn't as easy back then, and there were people who were on islands for dozens of years because they didn't believe that Japan would ever surrender, and they didn't hear the word from the emperor himself. They didn't get any of the pamphlets that were dropped out of these planes onto these islands, and so they just kept fighting in small groups and small clusters, basically living out in the wilderness together until the and having small raids and stealing food from small villages till, like, dozens of years later. Is insane. It's crazy. Look
of
it up.
this transformation was Article 9 of Japan's new constitution, adopted in 1947. This article renounced war and forbade
Like
Japan
a
from
forced
maintaining
adoption, like,
military
sign the
forces,
paperwork.
Article 9 declared,
Do it.
aspiring sincerely to an international peace based on justice and order. The Japanese people forever renounce war as a sovereign right of the nation and the threat of use of force as means of settling international disputes. The article goes on to add, in order to accomplish the aim of the preceding paragraph, land, sea, and air forces, as well as other war potential, will never be maintained. As we now
Mhm.
know, forever and never.
Says, "You know what, guys? You know what? I don't think" Japan's all like, "I don't think that I want to be violent anymore. I think that we should just give up. There's nothing compelling me to think any other way. I mean, why wouldn't I do that? This is my decision."
Never are tricky words. Turns out this was more of a for now kind of deal. But in all honesty, we knew this way before. Less than 5 years after the ink dried on Japan's pacifist constitution, the world was already pushing the country in a very different direction. When the Korean War erupted in 1950, the Cold War was in full swing, and the United
Yeah, the
States
Cold
needed
War.
help.
Don't get me started
Japan
on
was
that.
conveniently located as a bulwark against the communist threat, and suddenly Article 9 became more of a suggestion than a strict rule. Though Japan's Prime Minister at the time, Yoshida Shigeru, insisted his hands were tied, this didn't stop the US from practically begging Japan to remilitarize. Even after Japan regained its independence
Never ended? You're talking about the Cold War? Well, it did end because the USSR ended in 1991. That's why they officially ended the Cold War. But yeah, Russia kind of just took over where they left off, and so I guess yeah, technically we still haven't ever liked each other.
In 1952, the country remained tightly aligned with the United States through the US-Japan Security Treaty. The US maintained a large presence on Japanese soil with over 130 military bases, and
Lots of
Japan
bases.
effectively became an airstrip and staging ground for American operations during the Korean War, the Vietnam War,
Yeah,
and
we have
later
that little
conflicts
island
like
hop. We have Hawaii, then we have Guam somewhere around here, I believe, and then it hops into Japan. So now we have like a three-tiered system to kind of control this part of the world. That's why China right here is kind of blocked in here, North Korea, South Korea. This kind of area right here is our burden. There's Taiwan, I believe. So we're just kind of like keeping them self-contained. And like their missiles can hit Japan. Their missiles can hit Guam. I don't think their missiles can hit Hawaii yet, but these are all at risk. So this is kind of like our forward operating base. So yeah, just so we can control this area.
Iraq, and Afghanistan. Japan, despite its constitution's pacifist rhetoric, had become a key player in America's military strategy in Asia. The presence of these US bases and the arrangement that allowed Japan to host the largest American contingent abroad fueled a certain dependency on American military might. Japan, in a way, served as a floating aircraft carrier for the US, enabling
Basically, yeah,
intervention
that's a good
across
way
the
of putting
region
it.
at a moment's notice. But this wasn't enough for the US. So by 1954, the Self-Defense Force, SDF, was born, a compromise to satisfy both the US and Japan's desire to keep military activity to a minimum. Critics called the SDF the start of a reverse course, accusing Japan of betraying its post-war pacifism. Despite the formation of the SDF, Japan remained far from a full military power. The SDF was designed to defend the country, not wage war, as Japan continued to cling to its anti-war ideals. However, the wheels of militarization were in motion, and the pacifist constitution, while a noble gesture, was starting to show more and more cracks. These cracks were particularly visible after the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union collapsed. The US-Japan military alliance, which had been largely justified by the need to counter communism, was now left without a clear purpose. Japan entered a period of economic stagnation and identity crisis. The booming economy of the 1980s collapsed, leaving many to question the nation's place on the world stage. At the same time, nationalist sentiment grew, and some leaders began to feel that Japan
What's the funniest hate comment you've ever received? A lot of people say that I'm boring, that I'm not cool, and I think they're right. So I guess that's not really hate, is it?
had apologized enough for its wartime actions, and that it was time to shed its post-war identity. This shift was reflected in the 1991 Gulf War, where Japan's refusal to send troops due to its pacifist constitution became a point of humiliation. So only a year later, the Japanese parliament authorized the country's participation in the United Nations peacekeeping operations. It started in Cambodia, where Japan sent 600 troops in an engineering unit, 75 civilian
So
police
basically, just
officers,
research.
8 unarmed military.
Military research is basically observers. See, basically, they just are starting to dabble. They're starting to get tastes because they want basically stuff to analyze and research so they can start their own military situation.
Observers and 41 civilian election observers. Next, Japan sent units to Mozambique to primarily coordinate the transport of personnel and cargo at harbors and airports. In total, the country dispatched 3 control units of 48 personnel each. Japan also sent 5 staff officers and 15 electoral observers. East Timor was another destination where Japan sent personnel in the early days, with over 2,000 engineering unit troops, 17 staff officers, and 3 civilian police officers in the contingent. Now, these missions might have had the word peace in their name, but many Japanese people saw them as an erosion of the nation's pacifist stance. It wasn't a full-scale militarization, but it was a notable compromise. These reactions didn't seem to sway the Japanese government, as the country had quietly ramped up its military capabilities under the guise of defense by the late 2000s. The creation of anti-submarine helicopter carriers, essentially aircraft carriers with slight modifications, highlighted this growing militarization. So did the development of plans to fortify the Nansei Islands, where China was disputing a part of the territory. These plans indicated Japan's readiness to assert its security interests in the region. By 2010, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe took these ideas further, aiming to make Japan a normal country again, one with the right to defend itself and send troops to foreign engagements. A key moment came in 2014, when Abe approved a reinterpretation of Article 9. This move allowed Japan to exercise collective self-defense, essentially giving the country the right to fight alongside allies, including the US, if attacked. While Abe's government argued that this was a
I
necessary
mean, do you
step
really
to
feel
ensure
like if you had your own country and you had your own territory, do you think it would be right for you to not be able to defend yourself and to rely on another country to defend you? I know a lot of countries prefer that because it reduces their spending, but you're putting a lot on the line. You're risking a lot for a little in return, in my opinion. So,
Japan's security in a changing geopolitical landscape, the move sparked fierce domestic opposition, especially from those who viewed it as a betrayal of the pacifist ideals enshrined in Japan's post-war identity. Despite the resistance, Japan's militarization continued to grow. By 2015, the National Diet, Japan's national legislature, passed laws that allowed the SDF to support allied nations in combat. This marked a significant step away from the pacifism of the 1947 Constitution, further confirming that the country's military identity was being reshaped, even if unofficially. Abe's push to
pacifism is a
revise
phase.
Article 9
It
entirely
was
by
just a phase, guys.
2020, while not successful due to his resignation in 2020, showed that Japan's transformation from a pacifist to a more militarized state was well underway. The constitutional
How did I come up with my commentary style? Just me doing me. I should add background music. Not gonna do that. I think we have plenty of stuff going on already. Auditorial.
reinterpretation set the stage for an ongoing debate about Japan's military future, revealing that the cracks in Article 9 were not just superficial. They were structural and deepening as Japan navigated its security
That
interests in
giant
a
ship.
rapidly changing
Mitsubishi,
world.
baby.
And then 2022 came and obliterated any lingering illusions about Japan's pacifism. The Russian invasion of Ukraine jolted the global order, forcing Japan to accelerate its trajectory toward a full-scale militarization. But why? Why did a conflict some 5,000 miles away, in a region with no direct connection to Japan, trigger such a profound response? The answer lies in the unsettling parallels and implications the invasion posed for Japan's own security. It wasn't just about Ukraine. It was a wake-up call that revealed just how vulnerable nations could be in the face of aggressive neighbors. And remember, Japan has as many as 3 such neighbors, and all 3 of them are nuclear-armed dictatorships: China, North Korea, and Russia itself.
Imagine being
Russia's
that
war in
close to all
Ukraine
3 of those
highlighted
countries.
that even a nation's historical restraint or a lack of offensive capability doesn't guarantee safety. Hitoshi Nakama, a Japanese nationalist politician and fisherman, that second part will make more sense later, summarizes this perfectly. Peace relies on a balance of power. Russia attacked Ukraine. It's a mistake to think that we won't be attacked because we don't have any army or military bases. That era is over. This sobering realization resonated with many in Japan.
We talked about this earlier. We talked about it with the Israel-Palestinian conflict. We also talked about it with the Ukrainian and Russian conflict. We also talked about it with about previous conflicts that had happened in the past. If you have a territory that somebody wants and you are unable to defend it, they will take it and they will own it. That has been the law since the beginning of time. I've said it once, I'll say it again. That is why you need to have the ability to defend yourself. Like, that's the whole idea behind squatters, the whole idea behind stand your ground laws and castle laws, that kind of thing. It's the whole idea around the invention of America, the European or British Empire, the French Empire, the Spanish empires, all these things that happened. It was just people taking over land that other people couldn't defend. That's it.
Where public sentiment shifted significantly. For the first time since World War II, a majority of Japanese citizens expressed support for strengthening the country's military defenses. The invasion also exposed just how unprepared Japan was for sustained conflict. Retired Air Self-Defense Force General Toshimichi Nagaiwa pointed out that Japan was like 200 meters behind in a 400-meter sprint when it came to modernizing its military capabilities.
That makes sense, too.
Years of underinvestment and the long-standing 1% GDP cap on defense
And it could
spending
fall
left
further
Japan
and
with
further
inadequate
behind.
munitions, spare parts, and other critical resources. The contrast with China, whose defense spending surpassed Japan's decades ago, underscored the urgent need for reform. Speaking of China, we can't discuss Japan's reasons for a more formal militarization without mentioning this enduring rival. Japan and China share a history fraught with conflict and mistrust, rooted in both ancient and modern grievances, which continue to shape their volatile relationship. The Second Sino-Japanese War, which lasted from 1937 to 1945, was marked by immense suffering, including the horrifying Nanking Massacre. This period of brutality has left lasting scars, with ongoing debates about Japan's acknowledgement of its wartime atrocities fueling tensions. After World War II, Japan's post-war economic rise contrasted sharply with China's struggles during its communist transformation, establishing Japan as the dominant power in Asia for much of the 20th century. The territorial dispute over the Senkaku Islands, known as the Diaoyu Islands in China, lies at the heart of contemporary tensions. These uninhabited islands, administered by Japan but claimed by China, have become a flashpoint for conflict. Chinese Coast Guard ships have routinely entered Japanese waters for years, testing the country's capacity to defend its sovereignty and pushing the region closer to confrontation. And a
Exactly what I was
prominent
saying.
figure in defending Japan's territorial claims is Nakama, the politician/fisherman we just mentioned. Nakama regularly sails to the contested Senkaku Islands to assert Japanese sovereignty. His actions, including hoisting the rising sun flag during his visits,
So he's got a
serve
fishing
as a
boat. He
symbolic
goes out
act of
there and he
defiance
like
against
plays the
China's
game with the
claims.
Chinese.
However, they also underscore just how tense this region has become. Adding to the tension is Japan's rapid military expansion, which has drastically outpaced Japan's capabilities. Between 2016 and 20, China's navy launched as many ships as Japan's entire fleet, and in 2022, Beijing's military drills included firing 5 missiles into Japan's exclusive economic zone. Of course, there's also the Taiwan issue. Japan's geographic proximity and strategic importance tie the country's fate to the outcome of any potential conflict. The Japanese island of Yonaguni lies a mere 60 miles away from Taiwan, ensuring Japan's involvement in any cross-strait confrontation.
I think that's even closer than China is to Taiwan. Japan is actually closer to Taiwan than China, and there's like right off the coast of China.
Especially given its role as a key hub for US military operations in the region. Recent years have seen Japan describe China as an unprecedented strategic challenge, which is also unprecedented for this formerly pacifist nation. Previously, Japan's concerns about China were a public secret. Everyone knew it, but no one really said it out loud, or at least in this capacity. Now, Japan was no longer hiding behind veiled language and diplomatic niceties. Japan also aligned itself more closely with US allies in the region, including South Korea, the Philippines, and Australia.
I still think that America is stronger than China. And Australia is aligned with America. Japan should be aligned with America. Yeah.
And South Korea is a huge deal, given the two countries' less-than-friendly history. South Korea was once a Japanese colony, and the scars of that era run deep. However, with East Asia becoming the new stage for a Cold War, the two countries were forced to leave their differences behind. As you can imagine, this newfound alliance was met with nothing but hostility from North Korea. North Korea has posed a growing threat to Japan for decades, particularly since the 1990s, when it began its nuclear weapons program. For Japan, this marked a shift in its...
It's so surprising that we went and we invaded Iran because it was alleged that they had nuclear capabilities, and apparently they did not. And then now we weren't willing to do the same thing for North Korea when we knew for a fact they were trying to make nuclear weapons. I think that's just because China doesn't want anybody trying to enter anywhere near their territory, and North Korea is right on the border. But here's the thing: I feel like if America had threatened hard enough to go into North Korea, China would have just handled it and been all like, "No, don't come near us. We'll handle this. It's our backyard. We'll handle it. We'll handle it for you, okay?"
Security concern.
Either that, or they were aligned with North Korea, and they're all like, you know what, North Korea is our ally. But like the North Korea, it's weird because like, would you want, even if North Korea was your ally at one point, and then they got nuclear weapons? Like, what if they decided they don't want to be your ally anymore? Now you have another nation state near you that has nuclear weapons that you don't control or don't have influence. I think China's biggest move would be to not let North Korea have nuclear weapons.
As it was now facing a nuclear-armed neighbor. The country's missile tests, short-range, medium-range, and even intercontinental ballistic missiles, have repeatedly rattled Japan, with some missiles even flying over Japanese territory. One of the most notable incidents occurred in 2017, when North Korea launched a missile that flew over Hokkaido, Japan's northernmost island, prompting emergency alerts and public fear. That was not just a symbolic act. Instead, it demonstrated a chilling truth: Japan was within North Korea's striking range. In addition to missile tests, North Korea has conducted 6 nuclear tests since 2006, each escalating tensions in the region. Given Japan's history with nuclear weapons, these developments have struck a particularly nerve-wracking chord. As the only nation to have ever experienced the devastating effects of nuclear weapons firsthand, Japan has long positioned itself as a global leader in the fight against nuclear proliferation. However, the reality of North Korea's expanding nuclear arsenal has left Japan grappling with a tough dilemma. While the country has steadfastly upheld its 3 non-nuclear principles, no production, possession, or introduction of nuclear weapons, it also relies on the US nuclear umbrella for its security. After all, North Korea's nuclear and missile tests, coupled with its refusal to halt weapons development, have put Japan in an increasingly precarious position. The threat is no longer just a distant possibility, it's now a growing reality, one that Japan simply can't ignore as it seeks to protect its citizens and its sovereignty. So what exactly is Japan doing to protect its citizens and its sovereignty from North Korea and all the growing regional and global threats? Well, first, the country dramatically changed its national
What has
defense
happened?
strategy. Former Prime Minister Fumio Kishida
annoying. Sorry,
unveiled
guys.
this change in December 2022, publicly acknowledging that Japan's traditional pacifist defense posture was no longer sufficient in the face of rising threats. Kishida put it bluntly, "Our defense is insufficient. In order to drastically strengthen it, we're increasing the defense budget to 43 trillion yen over the next
much is
5
that?
years." This brings us to the most obvious sign that
Well, how
Japan
much is 43 trillion yen? Let's see. Yen to dollar, 43 trillion. I want to compare it to the U.S. defense budget. Almost 300 billion. So it's
might be
quite a
preparing
lot.
for
That's
a
a lot.
war, the
That's a lot, guys.
unprecedented military spending.
Massive.
The government plans to increase military spending by 60% by 2027, which would bring it to that 43 trillion
They got a lot
yen,
of
which
catching
was
up to
about
do, so that makes sense,
320
does it
billion
not?
US dollars in 2022, place Japan on track to become the world's third largest military spender, only behind the US and China. Kishida's government has also committed to spending up to 2% of Japan's GDP on defense, aligning with NATO standards. In late 2024, Japan approved a record-breaking $55.13 billion defense budget for 2025, marking the 13th consecutive year of increased defense spending. But what will Japan do with all that money? The
So
goal
it's
is to
not? So didn't they say that was like a certain trillion of yen? Like they said that it was 43 trillion yen, which is $290 billion, which is a massive amount of money. But now they're like saying 50? So maybe I missed
boost
something. Y'all
defense
tell me.
capabilities, including acquiring advanced weapon systems and fortifying military infrastructure. The weapon part is especially indicative of Japan's growing militarization. You see, as Article 9 is currently interpreted, Japan can't possess offensive military weapons. This means that Japan can't own intercontinental ballistic missiles, any weapons of mass destruction, aircraft carriers, or bomber fleets. However, this interpretation hasn't stopped Japan from deploying submarines, Aegis-equipped destroyers, helicopter carriers, and fighter aircraft. And all of these systems have substantial combat potential. One of the most significant acquisitions in this regard is the 400 US-made Tomahawk cruise missiles, which are capable of striking targets beyond
See,
Japan's
the thing
borders.
is
Because
a lot of the cost of military spending is research and development. And if we give them all the science and the research and the development part, then they can save a lot of money by spending a lesser amount on more things that, they don't have. It's discounted. Everything's discounted for them. It's the same idea of where China doesn't spend as much as us, but their dollar goes further. So this is an idea of like Japan's dollar going further. It's a great example of that.
nothing says peacekeeping like long-range missiles. Japan is
True.
also looking to
Deterrence, man.
develop indigenous long-range missile capabilities, though the timeline for their deployment is expected to extend into the 2030s. In addition to these offensive systems, Japan has expanded its defense with advanced missile defense technologies, including anti-missile systems deployed across the Okinawa Islands. The Okinawa Islands are also
Awani,
home to
thank you for the
Japan's
follow.
expanding military presence. The latest addition is a new base on Ishigaki Island, strategically located near Taiwan and China. This
Quick
base is part
reaction
of a
force.
broader effort to strengthen
Bubble,
Japan's
thanks for the
defenses across the
follow.
Nansei Islands,
Appreciate you
following
guys.
earlier installations on Amami
Like y'all come in
Oshima,
waves with the
Miyako,
follows.
and Yonaguni. The number of Japanese ground
I'll go for,
self-defense
like,
force troops on the island
10 minutes without getting a single follow, and then y'all like have like it's spreading the fire. B, thanks for the follow. Man, I don't know. Maybe I'll just forget to follow, and then when someone follows, you're like, I'll do it too. I mean, that makes sense, I guess.
has also
Thank
been
you for the
increasing
follows,
in
guys.
recent
Seriously.
years. Reports from 2024 put this figure to 570 troops and about 260 of their family members. Given that the entirety of Okinawa houses 55,000 US military personnel and 75% of all US military bases in Japan, this number might seem insignificant to you. However, this number is a massive deal for Japan, especially considering the challenges it faces in building its military personnel. Japan's recruitment has been running at about 20% below its targets for years, with concerns over a shrinking population and a growing reluctance to join the military exacerbating the issue. To address these challenges, Japan is focusing on improving recruitment strategies and
Aren't we
enhancing
all?
the appeal of military service. The country is also actively cultivating a more combative image for its self-defense forces. Japan has made great efforts to present its SDF as a
That
capable
guy's
and
just
effective
ready
force,
to kill
not just for
something.
disaster response, but for national defense. As part of these efforts, the SDF has been participating in an increasing number of military exercises. In 2024 alone, Japan took part in major military exercises. RIMPAC, Rim of the Pacific exercise, led by the US and involving 29 countries. Keen Sword, a
Wonder how that
US-Japan
went.
bilateral exercise. Malabar, a naval exercise hosted by India. And Pacific Vanguard.
These are also shows of force against China, who's showing of force, and North Korea, who's showing of force, saying like it's an eggplant measuring contest. Let's just say that much. And it's also a good opportunity for us to kind of like learn how to fight together in case something happens.
A joint
The show
naval
of force,
exercise with the
mostly,
US and other
very
allies.
expensive one.
The exercises are designed to strengthen the defense alliance and ensure Japan is prepared to respond to threats in the region, particularly from China and North Korea. But even with all these advancements, some experts believe that Japan is too late. It's simple. The pacifism of the overwhelming majority of the Japanese population has slowed the country's militarization, and now it's too late to catch up. Do you agree? Let us know in the comments section below. And while you're there, share your thoughts on Japan ending pacifism.
I think that having Japan as our ally and also having Japan as our newfound technological trading partner, because they have a lot to offer us, we have a lot to offer them, is going to be good. Because again, just like Israel is our hub in the Middle East to allow us to facilitate influence and control over that, Japan is a huge hub for our influence over in Asia. And Asia seems to be a bigger pocket of trouble for us in the future than, the Middle East is at this point. And we have a lot of more allies in the Middle East, I feel like, than we do in Asia, save South Korea, Japan, maybe Thailand, I guess, Vietnam, I guess. Australia's big over there. So I think we're doing pretty good. I think we're doing what we need to do.